disaster.
Thank you. Okay, let's see. My swimming competition was cancelled. I got a chance to change some of my slides, but not all of them. So Francois is going to see something he has seen before. And
but it was a pleasure, so I think that it will be a
repeated renewed pleasure, yes. Well, thank you for inviting me to this, to the NOPOOR consortium meeting, or working group meeting. And yeah, it was not a very long distance for me to come, so it was worked out okay. I am at the University of Louvain in Brussels, at the medical faculty in Brussels. So the hospital is in Saint-Luc, and as opposed to the main campus of the university, which is at Louvain-la-Neuve, which is about 30 kilometers from there. And I'm professor of epidemiology, but I also direct a WHO center which specializes in the epidemiology of civil conflict and natural disasters. So in other words, this center, which has been around now for about 35 years, has been from the start looking at how natural disasters affect human health and human populations in a slightly larger sense than just human health. And I'll explain a little bit what that means. And since about the early 1980s, starting with the Médecins Sans Frontières, we started working a lot more in civil conflicts and refugee populations. Mostly we started with Sudan, with Darfur, South Sudan, Somalia, Ethiopia, and there's Afghanistan. And now we do a lot of work on post-conflict, so stability issues. How do you stabilize populations when they have been exposed to a major shock? How do you make sure that there is not a relapse into conflict, which is the most frequent phenomena? So in other words, there are peace agreements signed, and there are people coming together, and everyone has meetings in Arusha, in Addis Ababa, and so on and so forth, and everybody signs everything. And then in about 2 years' time, we're back to square one. I mean, this has happened maybe 6, 7, 8, 12 times in the Congo, for example. In Angola is finished now, but the Congo goes on. You sign a bit of paper, and then it goes on. So, what we have been arguing in the last few years, and doing quite a lot of work with the EU as well, but not only, is to see whether services, in our case public health services and also education services, whether those sorts of civil, what we would consider public goods services, would actually have a better impact, a stronger impact on giving normalcy, a sense of normalcy to populations after they have come out of a conflict, and help to stabilize the community rather than just rely on some political process that is actually happening somewhere very far from where they live, and the people themselves in the field, in Darfur or in Juba, do not in fact get any of the peace dividends. We've been talking of 1990s peace dividends. We're going to get peace dividends. Let's all sign a peace agreement and there's going to be peace dividends. Well, the people down in the villages, they ain't seen nothing. They don't see any peace dividends. They don't see any change in their life situation at all. If they are lucky, they get some humanitarian aid, but that's it. So what we are trying to say is that now that many of the conflicts have sort of moved into a post-conflict situation, can we actually bring some peace dividends down to the people and hope that they will find it not so interesting to actually fight? Because at the end of the day, in a civil conflict, it's the sons and the young fathers who fight. So you have sons in a family, they are the ones who go out and fight for 3 months, 4 months, 5 months. And then they come back and do their farming. This is how it works. So there is no such thing as a combatant. There is no such thing as an army in which you're part of. They are part-time combatants and part-time farmers. So this is the situation we are dealing with in most. But I'll give you some I wasn't quite sure whether there would be epidemiologists here, and I think there are none. And so but anyway, I decided there might be, and so I didn't actually do anything about giving even the basics of epidemiology, which I thought people might already know. But very, very quickly, epidemiology is very simply the study of risk factors for contracting diseases. So that's the main bulk of what epidemiologists do. You have a room like this. Two of us have some sort of we are en train de cuver un petit rhume or something like that. There must be somebody who's en train de cuver quelque chose. And so the question is then, why is it that some of us, but the people in this room who are all exposed to that particular virus that one of us is busily spreading, why is it that some of us will get sick and some of us won't? Okay, so very simply, that is what epidemiologists would do, is to find out how people respond to exposure. So when you're exposed to a virus, all of us are exposed to this virus, and some of us are going to fall sick and some of us won't. So that's one of the things. They also do a lot of clinical trials. All the experiments with drugs, new drugs and things like that, that's all the kind of thing that they do. They do the clinical trials, risk factor studies, cohort studies on looking at breast cancer over time and so on. That's the kind of thing epidemiologists would do. The kinds of terms that they use would be which I'm sure many of you are familiar with, would be prevalence rates, incidence rates of disease, and these have very, very, very different implications on society and how you control health and you provide health services, when prevalence rates and incidence rates are absolutely essential to your understanding of how disease. So with that very general introduction, I will give you a few slides on civil conflicts and a few slides on natural disasters. You may want to look up, I didn't bring anything with me at all, but if you go to our website, you may want to look up, we've just come out last year with 3 reports that might be very useful for you. One is called People Affected, it's called, if you just do PAC CRED, you will get it. People Affected by Conflicts. So you do PAC CRED on Google and you will get, and then there is, I showed Delia, what was it called? The human cost. The other one is called the human cost of natural disasters. Human cost of natural disasters. And the third one, which we did for COP21, natural cost of disasters. And the third one that we did for, all of them are done with the UN. So the third one we did is something weather related. I forget the adjective. What is it? Weather-related disasters. So this is focusing on weather-related disasters. So if you do any one of these titles and do a CRED underneath, or just go to CRED, it will be the second on your Google list. The first, if you do CRED Google, then the first one, it was by somebody who has bought that place. We don't have the money to do that, but the second one will be our center. But if you do any one of these, you will get civil conflicts, natural disasters, and climate-related disasters. And most of the work that I'm presenting now is coming from some of these following publications. There's also a list of all our publications on our website. And that's the people affected by conflict. So the center has agreements with the NGOs and UN agencies, about maybe about 30, 35 of those, who actually send us surveys that they do in the different conflict-affected regions. They send us their surveys, and these are surveys that are done with a standard methodology. There is a international agreement with, say, for instance, International Rescue Committee, Médecins Sans Frontières, Save the Children, so on and so forth, and the Centers for Disease Control, Karolinska Institute, asked some academic institutions and the NGOs that they use a standard methodology when they do their surveys on mortality, nutrition and vaccination. They send us their surveys, we validate them and put them in a database. So there are about 3,700 surveys from about 51 countries which are unstable regions. So we are getting these black holes of statistics. We just focus in on those. And they measure mortality rates, under 5 child mortality rates, measles containing vaccine coverage, and malnutrition study. 5. Now, overall today in the world, you have about 150 million conflict-affected residents. So there are about 150 people who actually live today in very, very fragile, very insecure regions. About 18 million internally displaced persons and 4.7 million refugees. These numbers are obviously has changed in the last year or so because of Syria, but essentially the relative sizes are this. So refugees are relatively the smallest group, internally displaced are the next biggest group, and the conflict affected residents, which are actually the worst of the lot, although there's a little problem of access, but I won't go into it. These are people who essentially cannot, due mostly to poverty, cannot move out of where they are. They cannot move. They don't have the resources to pick up and go. I mean, it's like the migrants and the refugees that are coming in from the Middle East now. These are people who have the means to move. The really bad ones are stuck inside the country. So over here, very quickly, you see what the different health status indicators are on these different population groups. It's very important to define the population groups. Refugees are whenever anybody crosses a border, and therefore they have the right for protection and they have a right to humanitarian aid. So refugee situations are typically much, much better. Crossing the border is a fantastic thing to be able to do. Once you cross the border, you're saved. You will get support, you will get help. The worst off are the IDPs, the internally displaced, that is people like in Syria who have been forced to move out of the villages, move out of the towns, but they haven't been able to move out of the country. Those guys are usually the worst off because nobody has jurisdiction over them. Because sovereignty of the countries prevents the UNHCR or anybody to access these people. And the residents are slightly better off because they still maintain their social structures because they still stay home. Some numbers which are completely unreadable, obviously, I can see that, but if you go to the people affected by conflict, you will see it. It shows you the number of people, let me see if I'm getting this right, the number of people in the different countries who are living in conflict affected regions. So, sorry, this thing is, I'm pressing on something wrong, but anyway, we won't waste time. Oh, the other way. So, those ones are you have Pakistan, Nigeria, Iraq, Syria, DR Congo. Remember, the Syria situation has not been taken into account over here. And it shows you in blue how many conflict-affected residents there are in these countries. So it's quite a large number of people in many different countries who are living in conflict-affected regions. And these are the percent of the people of the total population who are actually affected by the conflict. This is the total mortality rate. It actually just supports what I just said, is the total mortality rate. The gray bits are the national estimates and the green bits are the estimates from people affected by conflicts. Now what is this? This one is crude mortality. This one is crude mortality rate. You have to start learning our layout people wanted absolutely to put little logos. So if you don't know the logos, you don't know what it's talking about. And this one is child mortality. So this is a little girl and this is a little baby, and that's the whole family. So all it represents is crude mortality here and child mortality here. And there you see the difference between the rates in the national statistics and the surveys. So in other words, what we are arguing is that the surveys that the NGOs do from the ground actually provides a much finer tuned, not necessarily more accurate, but probably more accurate, much finer and a very different picture from the national statistics. So in other words, when you see the national statistics, you have to remember that national statistics comes only from facilities or from institutions that are functioning. No facilities and no institutions function in the conflict-affected region. Nothing. They don't report anything. So in other words, when you have the national statistics, you have those parts of the countries that have no input into these statistics at all. These are the trends over time of acute malnutrition, global acute malnutrition, GAM, total deaths, crude mortality rates, and the child deaths, under 5 mortality rates. The trends look like this, and they are self-explanatory. It had been reducing over time, and now it's been going up again. Especially malnutrition. If the malnutrition goes up, if this goes up, after a while, this is going to translate itself to child mortality. That's all. The malnutrition after a while will simply decline because most of these children will have moved to the blue line. Measles vaccine, the coverage has been improving. Sometimes the funny thing in Somalia and in Democratic Republic of Congo, you have a situation where the small-scale surveys actually report a better situation than the national statistics. I don't know what negotiated statistics come out of those national sources, but essentially what the small-scale surveys show is that the vaccination coverage is sometimes better than the national statistics. So the situation may actually be better. Somalia, it is better than the national statistics. All the surveys in CDAT are georeferenced and mapped, so you can see dynamically through Google Maps. This is not a very attractive map at all, but you can see where the nutritional and malnutrition pockets are or the mortality pockets are. A quick word on epidemic diseases. The areas, the countries which are actually at war or are extremely unstable have a very high number of epidemic diseases that most of the time we don't even hear about. So these are epidemic diseases that occur in its natural state. So in other words, they simply go up, they exhaust the susceptible populations, and they go down again, and we either hear of them after it has gone down, or we hear of them when they're at a peak. So once the epidemic curve is at a peak, the international community reacts, the epidemic curve goes down, but in fact the epidemic curve would have gone down anyway, because it has simply exhausted the susceptible population, but it can always be interpreted to say, good Lord. So it can always be interpreted to say that we came and the epidemic curve went down. So in other words, this gives you an idea of all the potential epidemics that can be occurring in these areas. We've seen the Ebola crisis, exactly a post-conflict country, and we don't even know about them unless they become very traumatic. Now, the countries with the highest under 5 mortality rates, many of them, the top 10, many of them are in fact conflict countries. Sierra Leone, Angola, Afghanistan, Angola no longer actually, Liberia, Somalia, and DR Congo. So the worst kinds of health indicators are typically in countries that are unstable. Now, I'm going to give you a few slides on natural disasters. I'm well aware that I'm the only thing standing between you and lunch. So I will go through these rather quickly. So I give you some quick, how do you apply epidemiology to natural disasters? So this is drawn on the MDAT database. The MDAT database is a database which is a unique referral disaster database that exists, that has data from 1900 to today. So we have about 115 years and some days, 31 days of data. It collects the event, the physical characteristics of the event. It collects the human impact of the disaster, so the dead, injured, dead, injured, homeless, etc. It has the economic characteristics of the disaster, and then we have the geocoded, georeferenced footprint of the impact of this event. We have an agreement with about 20 institutions around the world, including the Red Cross, the Munich Reinsurance, the Swiss Reinsurance, Lloyd's of England, and so on and so forth, who give us data every day, and then we validate this whole protocol, and we validate those pieces publicly available and can be got from the website. The different kinds of disasters that we cover have been developed with an expert group from the technical division of Munich Reinsurance and us, and these are the different kinds of events that are mutually exclusive categories of natural disasters. Health impacts of natural disasters. What are the immediate health impacts? That's deaths and injuries, obviously. The largest impact has typically been the geophysical events like volcanoes and earthquakes mostly. Non-specific increases in mortality. So you have a general increase in mortality for a variety of reasons which are not specific. Infectious diseases, leptospirosis, hepatitis, diarrheal disease, respiratory and vector-borne diseases, and exposure to toxic substances, which is quite interesting in flooding, because sometimes when you have flooding in urban areas, it floods industries or home industries that use toxic materials like leather tanning. Leather tanning is very typically around cities, and when those get flooded, you get a lot of the toxic material in the waters. This shows you the trend of natural disasters worldwide. It just does show a trend in which natural disasters are, in fact, in the last 3 or 4 years, reducing in the numbers of events. Now that immediately has two reactions from the population. Either everyone's running around saying natural disasters are increasing. I mean, Al Gore, for example, likes to say that. It's increasing, and we are all going to get flushed away like Noah's Ark or something. Well, in fact, it's not. And there's nothing we can do about it. I mean, it's just good news, and we have to live with good news. So it is in fact decreasing, but the thing is, natural disasters are events, phenomena that have a very long cycle. So looking at something for 3 years and 4 years is simply not enough to see what the cycle is going to be like. So this is just maybe a very temporary thing which will rise again. That's one. Secondly, just because the number of events are reducing doesn't mean that the population affected is reducing. And even if the deaths are going down, which in fact it is, and I think Stephanie or somebody showed, that, I think it must have been Stephanie, she's the only one who did this assessment. The thing is, if the deaths are decreasing, what does it mean? It usually means that the numbers of the living is getting bigger. And that is a much bigger drain on development processes than if you're dead. Because the reality is, as they know very well in the medical sector, once you're dead, you're no longer a burden. It's going to happen to all of us. So we're going to all stop being a burden. But the people who live is the one who we have to take care of. So if you have higher rates of affected people, it does mean that the community, the society has to take care of many more people than it would have otherwise. Oh, this is animation. Global trends. So this is what it looks like. The blue guys are all the climate-related disasters, and the green bits are the geophysical. So essentially we're getting most of the increase in climate-related events and not so much in the geophysical events, which is not a very big surprise, since return periods of geophysical events are maybe 300, 400 years. Number of people affected, 55% are affected by floods. And this is something that I want to leave you with, is that floods are in fact today the most important phenomena that is affecting populations in Asia, Africa, and Europe. And the rest of the world actually. But floods are the biggest problem. By far is the biggest problem. And the problem with floods is that it has there's food waiting for us outside. You can come in. So the floods are a big deal. So floods are a big deal, and floods destroy harvests, they create malnutrition, they provoke disease. Waterborne diseases in particular, you can look at the slide, it will tell you exactly the kinds of waterborne diseases that they will provoke. This is how it usually works out. People play in the waters. Jakarta, people play, slums gets flooded. Children will play in the water, and that brings you the epidemic of leptospirosis. This is an example of the cholera and the tsunami. It's a really nice example, but I can give it to you later on because I don't have much time. We did a lot of work on cholera to control cholera after the tsunami in Indonesia, but in fact there was no risk of cholera at all in that, but there was a risk of tetanus, which nobody did anything about. Now I think this is about my, sorry, yeah. I would like to say one thing which has nothing to do with disasters, but the fact that children in developing countries are still dying of infectious diseases, regardless of what WHO tells you. You've heard it, you can quote me on this. Regardless of what WHO tells you, the main cause of death among small children in developing countries and in poor parts of developing countries is still infectious diseases and diseases that have completely preventable and cheap treatments. So measles vaccine, 100% efficient, completely free, is still the top killer of children. And I would like you to remember that during development. I think that's a very important thing. I saw in the title of this workshop that you wanted to look at scenarios, forward-looking scenarios. So I thought of 3 points I would like to make. It seems to me that in the next 5 to 10 years, there will be a polarization of development, and that there will be a concentration, an increasing concentration of poverty-related factors, and which includes infectious disease, undernutrition, premature deaths, will increasingly be concentrated in areas of instability. Not necessarily conflict, but instability. That is where you're going to get the bulk, and that is where it's going to be really hard to get any hold of, make progress. Flooding will increase, and with it severe droughts. They are the two parts of the same coin, and it will drive more displacement. And finally, innovative approaches will be needed to reach people, and much more engagement with local associations will be needed to make any progress at all in development in the next decade. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much. Yes. Yeah, one small question. Have you an explanation why there is this apparently stabilization of natural problems?
Disasters.
Disaster recently. Have you an explanation?
I would say that it's simply cyclical. Yeah. It's simply cyclical, because I see that earthquakes, if you look at earthquakes over 150 years, yeah, there are clusters.
No, but I mean mainly for flooding, because of earthquakes.
Flooding? I don't know flooding why. I don't have a response to your question. I really don't. Especially since flooding has, if you break up these disasters, looking at it by flooding storms and things, the flooding has increased a lot, but earthquakes have decreased. So when you look at the overall statistics that I'm showing you, it's a little falsified, so I don't know. The short answer to that is I don't know.
Other question, please? No? No more question?
Sugar drop.
No, maybe just a point. I completely agree with you, and there's not much work done about education in conflict or post-conflict areas. But what is true is that normally education is disrupted in those areas, and those who will take charge of education are not specialists of education. It will be mostly NGOs in emergency rather than in education. So
yes, but the problem is that no education specialist wants to go to South Sudan. That is the reality. You try to send somebody to Juba now, they won't go. So we don't have a choice. If you want somebody to go to the site in the eastern DRC,
So
good luck.
that's also true in refugee camps most often. So it's mostly that emergency education is not perceived as it's perceived as education, not as
An image. I think it's a big mistake, and I think people are recognizing it. Because you have a situation where adolescents. I mean, we have a project now going on with the EU on looking at education and health, and the Norwegians are doing the education part. You have situations where even if you have 2 years of a breakdown of an education, in Syria is going to be a big problem, it's going to be a time bomb. You have a breakdown, you have somebody from the age of 13 to 15 or 16 who has had no schooling. Good luck trying to get a 16 or 17-year-old who's been living in an unstable setting at about 17 with no education for the last 3 or 4 years. Good luck in getting him back into a democratic system.
Especially since in most countries there's no provision for dropouts of school age.
Schools.
Meaning if children leave school before the age of 15, then they're on their own until the age of 15 where they fall in the programs for adults.
Yeah, it's a big problem.
So there's also a big gap here in taking charge of those children and providing education,
Right.
relevant education to those populations.
Yes, democratic recovery in countries where there has been very high instability for 3, 4, 5 years is an uphill task that I don't think people recognize because of this lack of education of mostly adolescent children who will not have any education, no encadrement, for 3, 4, 5 years, and then they come at 17 or 18 with no schooling. So it's a problem, and I fully agree with you. It's not recognized very much at all.
No, there's been some work on Côte d'Ivoire and Burkina Faso because of the conflict in Côte d'Ivoire and the spillover from
Right.
Burkina Faso, but typically this type of problems arose. And
Sure.
Pascal?
Just one little question. It was very interesting, and you seem to produce a lot of data even yourself. And you were criticizing the data by WHO, l'Organisation mondiale de la santé. Do you have some cooperation, debates with United Nations organism, or?
Well,
your
we are a
opinion?
WHO center. Don't tell that to anybody. We are a WHO center.
Ah, okay.
But we do have the right
To
to
criticize.
say exactly, and I think they take it rather well actually, because I think they realize. You see, the problem is in the structure of WHO as opposed to UNICEF. WHO is governed by the ministries of health.
Okay.
Alors, so then their statistics by definition have to be negotiated statistics.
Okay.
This is the problem. They know it.
So what are your relations with NGOs working on similar?
Yeah, we have very good relations with NGOs. Very
so
close.
that they help to fuel the debate.
Exactly. They help to fuel the debate. I think NGOs have made a huge progress in the last 5 to 10 years in quality and in recruitment, and salaries. So they pay good salaries, and so the quality of their work is very, very good now. So we work very closely with them. Our conflict data comes from our network of NGOs and UN, and the natural disaster data comes from private sector companies and UNDP. UNDP sends us, UNDP country offices, and the Red Cross. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much. We have a lunch.